You spend your whole life climbing higher, chasing success, status, and admiration. But what happens when the voice in your head that helped you rise is the same voice that tears you down? The voice that pushes you to work harder, talk louder, and pretend longer. Because deep down, you believe that if the world just notices you, everything will feel okay. But that hunger, that pressure to become someone, it comes at a cost. 3 individuals from 3 different walks of life had it all. But their ego that helped them build their empires was also what burnt those empires to the ground. Ego doesn't show up wearing a villain's mask. It shows up as your best friend. It tells you that you deserve more. It whispers that no one truly understands you. It convinces you that your worth comes from what other people see, not who you are. And for a while, it feels good. Ego gives you confidence, shields you from failure, protects you from rejection. It builds a version of you that can survive in a world full of judgment. But here's where it gets dangerous. Ego is never satisfied. What starts as protection becomes addiction. An addiction to recognition, control, and superiority. It's a collection of masks you wear to survive. The confident leader hiding deep insecurities. The humble servant secretly craving applause. The quiet genius desperate to prove they're better than everyone else. And the more you wear the mask, the harder it is to take off. You start believing you are the mask. You forget where the real you ends, and the performance begins. But ego's greatest trick? It makes you feel untouchable right before you fall. Because when everything becomes about protecting the image, the truth gets buried. And when the truth finally breaks through, when the lies collapse and the mask cracks, ego is nowhere to be found. It leaves you alone, exposed, and broken. And this is where the real story begins. The story of people who weren't weak, but powerful and successful. People worshipped by millions, and yet they lost everything. Ego led them to destroy what they had with their own hands. And the first of these 3 people, let's just say, their fall wasn't quiet. It shook the business world to its core. And it all started with a single thought. I'm the one who can change everything. Adam Neumann walked into rooms and made people believe in his vision. A man who promised to elevate the world's consciousness and got billions of dollars to try.
That we're about to change the way people work and way people live, but more importantly, change the world.
But somewhere along the way, that vision turned into a mirror, and the only thing Adam was elevating was himself. The thing is, ego always begins with identity. For Adam, that identity was built on charisma. He spoke like a visionary.
If you're doing this just to make money, you're probably not in the right entrepreneurial business.
Walked into rooms like a king and convinced people that he was destined for greatness. This is what's called ego inflation. It's where someone builds their entire sense of worth on how big their dreams are and how loudly they can sell them. But underneath Adam's confidence was fragility. His early life was filled with change and uncertainty. Moving from Israel to the United States, struggling to fit in, chasing purpose in unfamiliar places. To cope, he created a false self, a version that was so polished, so larger than life, that it drowned out his feelings of not being enough. And at first, the mask worked.
Then you will deal with the tough times when they come. And that's what's really important. And if you do it right, by the way, working hard is fulfilling.
Investors poured billions into his vision, and employees cheered him on like a rock star. But this is exactly where his ego turned from protector to enemy. Because he wasn't just building a company anymore. He'd done that. Now it was about building a stage, a place where he could perform as his ideal self. The genius, the savior, the chosen one.
We're building a community that's transparent and that's accountable. That is WeWork.
This over-identification with success is where you stop seeing achievements as things you've done and start seeing them as who you are. But success, when fueled by ego, becomes an endless hunger. The bigger WeWork got, the bigger Adam's persona became. Private jets customized for spiritual reflection, personal schools teaching his own life philosophy, a company mission that went from shared office spaces to saving the human soul.
She said, find your passion. Do something that actually changes the world. Bring those two together. I promise you, you'll have the best business you ever imagined.
This is a clear example of grandiosity bias, where your purpose inflates beyond what reality can sustain. And eventually, the cracks began to show. The IPO filings revealed chaos behind the scenes, financial losses, conflicts of interest, and bizarre leadership decisions. The man who once captivated the business world suddenly looked incredibly reckless.
If you're moving and making a sound and I'm speaking, freeze.
And this is where Adam's ego reached its breaking point. In a painful clash of cognitive dissonance, the gap between who he believed he was and what reality was truly showing him. And instead of adjusting, he doubled down. He dismissed critics as small thinkers, blamed others for misunderstanding his vision. This common ego defense of externalizing blame aimed to protect his self-image from total collapse. But no defense can hold forever. When investors finally pulled the plug, Adam was forced to step down. The empire he built to prove himself had slipped through his fingers. In his story, this was the death of his ego, the moment where the applause stopped, and all that was left was the silence of his own thoughts. Which is right where self-deception creeps in. The part of ego that convinces you your motives are pure even when they aren't. It whispers that you're changing the world, when really, you're just chasing validation. Because the question has to be asked, was Neumann ever building for the world, or was he just building a monument to himself? Adam ended up walking away from WeWork with hundreds of millions of dollars. But ego doesn't crave money, it craves meaning. And when the identity he built collapsed, no amount of wealth could fill that void. Because that's the trap of ego. It gives you power, status, and admiration. But the second you start believing those things define you, you lose yourself to them. Adam Neumann built his kingdom on charisma and vision. But in the end, the thing that undid him was the very story he told himself. And yet, this is only one way ego destroys a life. Because sometimes ego doesn't wear the face of a charismatic leader. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, quiet, logical, calculating. And in the hands of someone who believes they're the smartest person in the room, ego can build a global empire of deception. Sam Bankman-Fried wasn't charismatic like Adam Neumann. He wasn't trying to build a spiritual empire or captivate the world with his charm. He wore wrinkled t-shirts, had messy hair, and spoke awkwardly.
Very over-collateralized a year ago. There was a total market collapse and, specifically a large correlated collapse in its assets,
But underneath that scruffy genius persona was an incredibly dangerous ego, because ego doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a mask of the misunderstood genius. And that's exactly the case with this story. Sam built his identity on intelligence. From a young age, his self-worth wasn't based on connection or belonging. It was based on being the smartest person in the room. This is known as intellectual ego, where your entire sense of self is built on your ability to outthink others. But ego built on intellect is fragile, because when you start to believe you're smarter than everyone else, you stop listening. And when you stop listening, mistakes no longer look like risks. They look like opportunities to prove how untouchable you are. At first, Sam used this to his advantage. FTX wasn't just a crypto exchange. It was a platform built on risk, complexity, and speed. A playground where Sam could prove his brilliance every single day. But as FTX grew, so did his belief that he could outsmart this system. This is where his overconfidence bias crept in. The belief that his past success guaranteed future success, even in situations far beyond his control. Sam stopped seeing risk as something to manage. He saw it as something to conquer. And the deeper he got, the more his ego created a mental split. On one side, there was the public image, the quirky, socially awkward CEO donating billions to charity, preaching effective altruism.
Goal is to, put myself in a position where I'll be able to donate almost everything that I make.
On the other side, there was the private Sam, the one secretly moving billions between FTX and his hedge fund, Alameda Research. Sam compartmentalized his persona, separating parts of his life so he never had to face the contradictions in his own story.
I don't run Alameda anymore. I don't work for it. None of FTX does, separate staffs. And the way that we view FTX is as a neutral piece of market infrastructure.
But eventually, the walls between those compartments broke. When the crypto markets crashed and people tried to withdraw their money, the truth finally surfaced. FTX didn't have the funds. Sam's empire was built on a fragile web of leverage, hidden transfers, and blind optimism. And this is where cognitive dissonance shows up again. Because when everything collapsed, Sam didn't admit defeat. He doubled down.
I don't know of FTX deposits being used to pay off Alameda creditors.
He gave interviews where he downplayed the damage. He told the world he just made mistakes.
I made a lot of mistakes or things I would give anything to be able to do over again. I didn't ever try to commit fraud on anyone.
But behind those words was an ego still clinging to the idea that he was too smart to fail. This is what happens when ego rewrites failure as bad luck instead of bad judgment. Sam couldn't face the truth because it shattered the story he built about himself. That he was the smartest person in crypto. That his brilliance could fix anything. That his actions, no matter how reckless, were somehow justified by his intelligence. But here's where his ego took its most menacing form: moral licensing. The belief that because you've done good things, like donating to charity or fighting for ethical causes, you're allowed to bend the rules elsewhere. In Sam's mind, the ends justified the means. If a few $1 billion disappeared, it didn't matter, because he thought he was building something bigger, something better, something that would eventually save the world. But that's the final ego trap, the one where you confuse your own desires with moral purpose. And by the time reality catches up, the damage is already done. Sam Bankman-Fried went from crypto's golden boy to the face of one of the biggest financial collapses in modern history. And yet, even now, there are moments where he speaks like the story isn't over, like redemption is still waiting for him on the other side of the courtroom, because that's what ego does. It turns failure into an unfinished chapter. It whispers that one day you'll prove them all wrong. But ego isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's the silent voice that keeps pushing you, long after you should have stopped. And when that voice takes hold of someone already addicted to winning, it can turn a lifetime of triumphs into a single, devastating fall. Lance Armstrong stood at the top of the world. 7 Tour de France victories, millions raised for cancer research, a global icon of resilience. But behind the glory, something darker was growing. Because even as the world cheered, Lance knew the truth. He wasn't racing to win. He was racing to outrun himself. Because ego doesn't always start with arrogance. Sometimes it starts with pain. And for Lance, that pain ran deep.
Proven my class. I've showed my class from day one. There's no secrets here. We have the oldest secret in the book. Hard work.
From a young age, his identity was built on one belief: fight or be forgotten. Raised in a tough environment with a constant need to prove his worth, he learned early on that vulnerability was weakness. This is known as defensive ego formation, when a person builds their confidence not through self-acceptance, but through the need to protect themselves against the world. Winning wasn't about the trophy. It was about proving that no one could break him.
On Wednesday, October 2nd, I was diagnosed with testicular cancer. Prior to seeing my doctor last week, I had been experiencing swelling and pain in one of my testicles, and I coughed up some blood.
And when cancer nearly ended his life, his ego found new fuel. The story of the survivor, the warrior, the miracle man.
To come back and to win and to be successful, I would consider that a complete recovery as an athlete.
This self-narrative reinforcement is where your identity becomes tied to a heroic story you tell about yourself. And the world believed it, because it was a story people wanted to believe. But behind the legend, something else was happening. Lance wasn't just competing against other cyclists. He was competing against doubt, against fear, against the possibility that without winning, he was nothing. This is where his ego became toxic. The need to win transformed into the need to dominate. And to protect that domination, he turned to performance-enhancing drugs.
Then came the question, have you ever taken any performance-enhancing drugs? And Lance said yes. The doctor said, what were they? And he said, EPO, growth hormone, cortisone, steroids, and testosterone.
But the drugs weren't the biggest lie. The biggest lie was the one Lance told himself, that he deserved to win, that everyone else was cheating anyway, that protecting his legacy justified anything. This is a psychological trap called moral disengagement. It's when your mind creates excuses to make wrong decisions feel right. And the further Lance went, the more his ego isolated him. He attacked anyone who questioned him. Teammates, journalists, even former friends. He protected his identity so fiercely that he destroyed relationships to keep it intact. But no one can outrun the truth forever. When the doping investigations finally caught up, the fall was catastrophic. Titles stripped, sponsors gone, reputation shattered. The man who built his entire life on winning lost everything that gave him meaning. His ego collapse came overnight. The identity he'd built fell apart, and there was nothing left to replace it. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. Even after the confessions, the apologies, the public shame, Lance still struggled to let go of the story. He spoke about making mistakes, but there were always hints, subtle suggestions that maybe he was misunderstood, maybe his victories still meant something. This is called identity entrapment, when you can't separate yourself from your past even when it's destroyed you. Because ego hates emptiness. It would rather cling to a broken legacy than face the silence of starting over. And yet, underneath all of this, there was something very human. A man who fought for survival his entire life, who couldn't stop fighting even when the battle became self-destructive. And therein lies the tragedy of ego. It doesn't just hurt the people around you, it traps you in a story you can't escape. Lance Armstrong taught the world about resilience, but in the end, the person he needed to forgive was himself. And that leaves us with one final question. When everything falls away, the fame, the victories, the applause, who are you without your ego? Ego built their empires, and ego tore them down. But their stories aren't rare, they're a mirror. Because every one of us wears a mask, craving recognition, hiding weakness, running from silence. And unless you face that voice inside, the one that says you're nothing without success, you'll keep chasing shadows that disappear the moment you touch them. One day the likes will fade, the image will crack, and you'll have to face what's underneath. So ask yourself, will it be enough? If you found this video valuable, do us a favor and click that like button, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you want to dive further down the rabbit hole with ego, there's a full source list down in the description waiting for you. And before you go, imagine someone just like you, successful, admired, untouchable, hiding a darkness you couldn't see. Ego is dangerous, but psychopaths? There's something else entirely. Click here to uncover what happens when power, charm, and cruelty live in the same body. Thanks for watching.